On an afternoon in May of 2017, a man in Montgomery County, Missouri, texted one of his close friends and said that there was something he wanted to tell him. It wasn't anything all that urgent, at least he didn't think so, but it was unusual enough that he wanted someone else to know. It was about something that had happened to him the day before. Out of nowhere, he'd gotten really sick, and while he was pretty sure he knew what had happened and he was feeling better now, the whole thing felt a little strange. Now, at the time, neither the man nor his friend took this very seriously. In fact, they were joking about the whole thing and sort of laughing about this all being like a big conspiracy or something. Well, unfortunately, what they didn't know was that this bit of dark humor was much closer to reality than they realized. In fact, the very conversation they were having, it would eventually prove that there was something incredibly sinister happening. The full context behind this text exchange and the story behind what was really going on here is what today's case is about. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In late spring of 2017, things couldn't have been going much better for Ben Renick. At just 29 years old, he was happily married, he was the loving father of 2 young children, he had a beautiful home, and he was the owner of a thriving business. He was also on the verge of completing the biggest deal of his entire career and starting a new chapter of his life. Now, Ben's business was a bit unusual. He made money by breeding and selling exotic snakes. Ben had been obsessed with snakes ever since he was a kid. As a young boy growing up in the town of New Florence, Missouri, he would spend countless hours catching whatever he could find on his family's 72-acre farm. This had started out as a hobby, but as he got older, he had managed to turn this passion into a hugely successful business. Ben sold a ton of different kinds of snakes, but he specialized in ball pythons. He ran his company, Renick Reptiles, out of an outbuilding on the family farm property, not far from the house where he lived with his wife Lindley and their 2 kids, Matthew and Emma. Even though the Renick family farm was in this tiny town of less than 1,000 people, Ben's company was not some small operation. I mean, technically it was a family business. Ben did most of the work with the help of Lindley, but the company itself brought in quite a lot of money, and Ben was known all across the country in the reptile community. The reason for this was that Ben was a talented breeder. A huge part of the appeal for people who own and collect ball pythons is the different colors and patterns on their skin, known as morphs, and Ben was extremely knowledgeable about snake genetics. Using his knowledge and experience, he was able to breed snakes with incredibly specific looks to them. These so-called designer snakes are highly sought after, and as a result, they can sell for tens of thousands of dollars or more. Ben didn't just have a knack for unique python morphs, though. He was also just generally very good at caring for his animals. It wasn't uncommon for him to raise them to be 12 to 15 feet long and hundreds of pounds, which further increased how much people were willing to pay for them. Ben's talents had made him a big name in the reptile world, and he was known in this community across the United States. But what really endeared him to people was who he was as a person. Whenever Ben attended trade shows or events, he made a real effort to get to know people. He was gracious with his time, eager to share his knowledge, and according to the people that knew him, it was just very clear how passionate he was, to the point that even in his off time, he made videos educating other enthusiasts and showing off the behind the scenes of his business. I mentioned before that Ben was on the verge of completing the biggest deal of his career, and actually, this was something that was kind of bittersweet. You see, Ben had arranged to sell off the vast majority of his snakes, and he was thinking about quitting the business altogether. He'd made a deal with an NHL goalie named Robin Lehner. Lehner was planning to start his own breeding company and had agreed to pay Ben $1.2 million in exchange for most of his animals. That agreement had been finalized, and Lehner had already started paying Ben quarterly installments of $200,000. Now, you're probably wondering, why would Ben sell most of his snakes if his business was doing so well? Well, there were a couple of reasons. For starters, running Renick Reptiles was a lot of work. But the bigger motivator was that Ben wanted to make sure that his family was in a good position financially. especially because he'd seen firsthand just how quickly good fortunes could change. As I said before, Ben spent his whole life on his family's 72-acre farm. That farm had been purchased by his parents, and he was raised there along with his older brother Sam. When they were kids, Ben and Sam lived a very comfortable life. Their father, Frank Renick, was the owner and president of a large pet food company called Spectrum Pet Care. The success of the business meant that they had pretty much everything they could ever want growing up. But as they got older, Ben and Sam had watched as their family was torn apart by tragedy after tragedy. It started in the early 1990s, when one day they lost their home. A gas leak caused the residence to explode, and while thankfully no one was killed, the house was completely destroyed, along with all of their possessions. It took the family years to rebuild, but just as they were getting back on their feet, they got some terrible news. Ben and Sam's mother, Charlene, was diagnosed with a very serious form of breast cancer. She fought for years, but eventually passed away in 2008. The emotional and financial toll from both of these incidents was hard enough, but the worst was still yet to come. In 2012, Frank Renick was indicted on fraud charges related to the pet food business. It was alleged he'd embezzled and stolen from investors to the tune of more than $7 million, and he was facing a lengthy prison sentence. While Frank was able to save the family farm by putting the land in Ben and Sam's names, before he could face trial, he did something else that scarred the boys forever. In June of that year, he took his own life by shooting himself in the chest on Father's Day. Ben was the one who found him. As I'm sure you can imagine, this trauma had stayed with Ben, and he'd wanted to make sure that nothing like this ever happened now that he was a dad. So this deal he'd made, it would make sure that he and his family were set for life. Even though Ben wasn't sure what he was going to do next, whether he wanted to build back up Renick Reptiles or do something new altogether, there was still plenty to keep him busy. He was raising 2 growing children. There was always plenty of work on the farm, and about a year earlier, he'd also helped Lindley to start her own business. So yeah, overall, it was a time of excitement and possibilities. Or at least, it should have been. You see, just when it seemed like Ben Renick was at this incredible high point in his life, tragedy would come for him once again.
911, what's the address of the emergency? Oh, God. I just got home with my kids there in the car, and I went to go check on him, and I saw him on the ground. Okay, do you know what happened to him?
The 911 call that you just listened to was placed at around 5:30 p.m. on June 8th, 2017. It was made by Lindley Renick, who said that she just arrived home to a nightmarish scene. After not being able to get a hold of Ben that afternoon, she'd gone to check on him at their snake warehouse. That's where she'd found him unresponsive in a pool of his own blood on the floor. As you heard, Lindley was completely hysterical, and she was barely able to speak to dispatchers or offer many further details. Part of the way through the call, though, someone else took over the conversation. It was Ben's brother, Sam.
Oh my God, my brother's dead.
Okay, so he's not breathing at all?
No, he's cold. He's blue.
Okay, and it's not obvious what happened? Like you're not sure what happened?
Oh my God, my brother's dead. My brother's dead. Oh my God.
Okay, does it look like he's been shot?
Yeah, maybe. No.
You don't know? Do you know where the blood is coming from?
Head.
His head?
Head. Oh my God.
Sam had been called by Lindley moments before all of this. He also lived on the farm in a separate house with his family and had rushed over immediately after hearing something was wrong with Ben. And while he was similarly shocked by what he just walked into, as he kept talking to 911 dispatchers, he said he had an idea as to what might have happened here.
Ben? Oh God. Oh God.
Okay, do you know anything, like how long he's been there? Do you know?
Oh, he's gone.
What may have happened?
He got killed by a snake.
By a snake?
He raised this large 500-pound snake. I need to be out here now.
After making his way into the snake warehouse, Sam found Ben lying face down on the floor. There was blood everywhere, but it was when Sam turned his brother over that the true terror of the situation set in. Ben's head was completely disfigured, almost like it had been crushed. And in Sam's mind, there was only one thing that could explain this. Ben had been attacked by one of his snakes. Now, obviously, an escaped 500-pound killer snake sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. So when officers from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, they didn't really know what to do. All they knew for sure was that they had a dead body, there were hundreds upon hundreds of snakes in the building, and that one of them was potentially loose.
I understand you have an anaconda. Okay, where's it at? I know it's difficult right now, but we need to make sure nobody else gets hurt.
Shit. You good, Brian?
Yeah.
What is this place?
Where's the victim upstairs?
He's behind those bins and whatnot.
Fellas, something got him. Paramedic said there's a bite mark on him, so there's a snake loose in here. So watch your ass.
So yeah, even the police were scared shitless. And I mean, can you blame them? I know you wouldn't catch me going down there, that's for sure. At the same time though, they had a job to do. And eventually they were able to clear the area with enough confidence to allow the medical examiner to go in. But that's when things took an even more unsettling turn. You see, despite what paramedics initially thought was a bite mark on Ben's arm, he had not been killed by one of his snakes. Upon closer inspection, the ME was able to find multiple shell casings close to the body, as well as bullet fragments. A full autopsy would later reveal that Ben had been shot 8 times. Most of the wounds were to his back, but one was to his head, and that injury was particularly brutal. It was a contact wound, meaning that the gun had been pressed directly against Ben when it was fired. The resulting damage was devastating, seemingly explaining why Sam had mistaken it for a crushing injury. Based on these details, it was evident that Ben Renick's death was no accident. This was a murder. But who would do something like this, and why? Well, as authorities were about to discover, despite how well-liked and admired Ben was, there was no shortage of people who stood to potentially benefit from his death. In fact, they were about to find themselves in the middle of an incredibly complex case, one with a long list of potential theories and suspects. After launching an investigation, the first explanation the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office considered was that Ben Renick's death was a robbery gone wrong. There were plenty of people who knew about his snake business, and detectives wondered if someone had tried to take advantage of this information. Perhaps they assumed that Ben kept a large amount of cash at his home, or maybe they were after the snakes themselves. After all, even 1 or 2 of these reptiles could have potentially been sold for tens of thousands of dollars to the right buyer. However, this theory ran into a problem as police continued their search of Ben's warehouse. Not only did it turn out the whole escaped snake thing was a false alarm, all of the animals were accounted for. And as far as anyone could tell, nothing else appeared to be missing from the property either. Of course, there was still the possibility that this was not about money, at least not in the immediate sense. Ben was a superstar in the snake breeding community. And sadly, talent like that sometimes has a way of bringing out the worst in others. Detectives wondered, was this maybe a fellow breeder or collector, someone who was jealous of Ben's success and recognition? The idea certainly seemed to fit with the brutality of the crime. I mean, shooting someone 8 times feels pretty personal. And then there was the fact that the Renick farm was kind of in the middle of nowhere. You wouldn't have known where to find it or that there was this massive snake breeding facility there unless you were familiar with Ben and his business. Understandably, it was going to take a while for investigators to get an idea of who might have had it out for Ben in the reptile community. In the meantime, though, while we're on the subject of potential personal motives for murder, there were some other people that police knew they needed to look into, starting with Lindley. As Ben's wife, Lindley directly gained financially from his death more than anyone. Not only did she get all of his snakes and his business, Ben had a $1 million life insurance policy. To top it all off, Ben had full ownership of the Renick family farm at the time of his death, meaning that Lindley now had the rights to that as well. All told, she was set to inherit property and assets worth about $3 million. When Lindley came in for an interview, though, she said she did not see the situation that way. She was completely lost without Ben, and she didn't even know what to do with most of this stuff.
Do you have any questions for us?
What happened?
We don't know yet.
What do I do?
I know your friends and family.
Of course, $3 million is a lot of money, so detectives were skeptical. But Lindley said this was nothing compared to what she had lost. Lindley explained that Ben was the best thing that had ever happened to her. They first met when they were younger, but it wasn't until they reconnected in their early 20s that they gotten together. By that time, Lindley was already a single mother, but Ben wasn't intimidated by that at all. Instead, he took in her and her young son Matthew and raised him as his own. Before long, their family had grown. They had their daughter Emma shortly after moving in together on the Renick farm, and about 2 years later, in the spring of 2014, they were married. Lindley said that Ben was an amazing dad, and she never would have done something like this to him or their kids. But even more than that, she had no reason to. Her life was perfect. In addition to all of the success and happiness that Ben's hard work had afforded them, it had also allowed her to start a business of her own. In 2016, Ben had helped her to open a spa in the city of Columbia called Essentia. Lindley explained that this was a dream come true for her. She didn't care about some inheritance. She already had everything she could ever want and more. And she loved the life she and Ben had built together. As it turned out, Lindley wasn't the only one who told detectives this. When they started asking around, they heard pretty much the same thing everywhere. Friends and family members said that Lindley was an incredibly sweet woman, and that she and Ben had a great relationship. They had a lot in common, and they did a lot to support each other. Whether that was financially, like with Ben helping Lindley to open her spa, or more directly, like when Lindley would travel with Ben to trade shows and events to help with the snake business. Even those that barely knew the couple said that they were great together. A guy named Michael, who had dated Lindley years earlier and who was now a customer at her spa sometimes, said that as far as he knew, they were very happy. Given the huge potential financial motive, authorities still couldn't rule Lindley out, though they also knew that they needed to look at other potential suspects. And it was here that actually Lindley had some insights to share as well, specifically about Ben's brother, Sam. You might have noticed a minute ago that I said that Lindley became the sole owner of the Renick family farm after Ben's murder, but that I also stated before that the property was left to both Sam and Ben after their father's death. So what was the deal with that? Well, unfortunately, the situation appears to be a bit fuzzy. In our research, sources, including interviews with Sam himself, seem to contradict each other. In some, it stated that the property was actually only left to Ben, while others say that it was left to both of them, but that Sam ended up signing over his rights to Ben because he was afraid about the legal implications of an upcoming divorce. It's unclear which of these accounts is actually true. And like I said, Sam himself seems to give different versions of events based on the interview. But what we know for sure is that at the time Ben was killed, he had sole ownership of the property. What we also know is that this had driven a wedge between the brothers. Here's how Lindley described the situation while speaking to police.
Was there any family issues?
Like between Sam and, yeah. Ben and I actually own all of the property. Sam kind of basically just went to Ben and he was like, you need to give me half of the property. Ben was like, no, I'm not going to give you half of the property. Then they were like, well, we can't afford to live out here. We're going to have to move.
What is Sam's demeanor like in general?
I mean, it's kind of a depressed personality. He's overly dramatic. And he's just so different than Ben. He's a lot more in your face.
This seemed like it could absolutely be a motive for murder. You know, not only was Sam feeling like he had been robbed of his half of the family farm, but with Ben thinking about the future and maybe wanting to get out of the snake breeding business altogether, Lindley said that one of the things he was considering was selling the farm. And that meant that Sam and his family would have to move. When Sam came in for his own interview with investigators, he was remarkably upfront about how he felt about the whole situation, as well as his brother. And let's just say what he told detectives wasn't exactly flattering.
Ben and I are close. Ben and I don't have a lot in common. We just didn't hang out at the top, really. Kids only lived next door to each other. He liked to brag a lot. He's always that's one of the reasons I didn't like hanging around Ben. He's always talking money. Ben got ownership of the land. I got most of the money. Ben couldn't afford the land, not the money, so we had to work together to make it happen. Complicated.
How'd y'all do that?
That's a good question. I don't know if we really did.
Needless to say, this raised some eyebrows, especially considering what police had already heard from Lindley. But at the same time, Sam was cooperative. He told detectives that they could ask him whatever they wanted, and that he would do any kind of test or give them any kind of sample they needed. Detectives took Sam up on this offer and asked him if they could swab his hands. They'd done the same thing with Lindley during her conversation. They were looking for gunshot residue potentially left behind if either of them were Ben's killer. Each of them agreed, and both tests came back negative. Now, understandably, this was good for Sam and Lindley, but it was a problem for police. You see, these were their two strongest suspects, and the rest of the theories they were investigating, they weren't really panning out either. I mentioned before that detectives were looking into other people in the snake breeding community to see if Ben had any known enemies. Well, that hadn't really gone anywhere. In fact, all police really learned was how much Ben Renick was loved by his fellow hobbyists. In the wake of his death, many prominent people in the community held charity auctions and events raising tens of thousands of dollars. That money was given to Lindley to help her and the kids get through this awful time. What was even more challenging for authorities was that, other than what I've already told you, there wasn't much evidence at the crime scene. No murder weapon was recovered, all of the blood and DNA present belonged to Ben, and they had no witnesses. In other words, the investigation was starting to hit a wall. Out of desperation to try and keep the case from going cold, detectives started entertaining more out-there sorts of theories. Like, maybe Ben's murder was related to his father's fraud scheme. You know, Frank Renick had ripped off a lot of people, and perhaps a disgruntled investor had decided to kill Ben years later to get some sort of revenge. But this idea also failed to lead to any kind of breakthrough. Keep in mind, too, everything I'm talking about here was all behind the scenes. From the perspective of the public, it was radio silence. After the initial wave of news reports, all anyone really knew was that Ben had been murdered and that his killer was still at large. The more time that went on, the more this uncertainty led to finger-pointing. Not just in the snake breeding world, where plenty of people still thought one of their own community members might have been responsible for the crime, but in Ben's family. Shortly after the murder, Lindley ended up selling the Renick farm, and she and her kids moved away. This meant that Sam and his family also had to leave, but arguably that wasn't even the worst part. Because Lindley said she was convinced Sam was behind Ben's murder, she also cut him and his family off from seeing her and Ben's children. This situation, the tensions and swirling rumors and accusations, it would go on for 2.5 years without any kind of resolution. That was until something happened that began to completely unravel this whole disturbing mystery. This new lead didn't just come from an unlikely place. It would take police back to the start of their investigation in more ways than one. You see, it turned out there had been a snake hiding at the center of this case since the beginning. It just wasn't a literal one. In January of 2020, so again 2.5 years after Ben was killed, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office received a phone call out of the blue. It was from the Missouri State Highway Patrol. They said that they had just conducted an interview that they thought they should know about. That interview was with a man named Brandon Blackwell, and he claimed that he had some valuable information about Ben Renick's murder. In order to understand who Brandon is and what he told authorities, though, first, we have to rewind a little bit. As I said a minute ago, shortly after Ben's death, Lindley sold the Renick family farm, and she and the kids moved away. To many people, this seemed quite sudden. But at the time, they didn't really question it. Everyone knew that Lindley wasn't going to be able to continue running Ben's business by herself, and the snakes were supposed to be sold off anyway. On top of that, it was reasonable to not want to live in the same place where your husband was murdered, especially with his killer still on the loose. So yeah, all of this made sense. But Lindley's actions in the weeks and months that followed were a lot harder to understand. Particularly when she announced on social media that she was pregnant with her third child. And this was not like a child that Ben had conceived before he died or something. The baby's father was Brandon Blackwell. Lindley and Brandon had moved in together not long after the crime. And this pregnancy announcement came just 7 months afterwards. To say this was a shock to those that knew Ben and Lindley would be a massive understatement, but the whole situation soon got even stranger. And that brings us back to why Brandon Blackwell wanted to speak with police. You see, despite deciding to have a child together, this new relationship between Lindley and Brandon had quickly soured. And when it did, things got ugly fast. Lindley ended up getting an order of protection against Brandon, one that he had been accused of repeatedly violating, enough that recently he'd been arrested and was now facing 2 counts of first-degree stalking and 5 counts of violating a restraining order. Finding himself behind bars and realizing that he was facing some serious jail time, Brandon was looking for a way out. And as it turned out, he had one. After asking to sit down with authorities, he dropped a bombshell. He said that not only was Lindley the one who killed Ben, she hadn't done it alone.
My information is out of the horse's mouth.
Okay. And by the horse, you mean Lindley? Or...
We'll get to that.
Okay.
During his interview with the Missouri State Highway Patrol, Brandon said that throughout his relationship with Lindley, he got a weird feeling about Ben's murder. At first, whenever he tried to talk to her about it, she sort of brushed him off, but he'd kept asking.
I just had a really odd, strange feeling about it, and just little stories weren't right, and so, yeah, I kind of kept poking her about it, and, it was like, I need to know what really happened.
Eventually, Brandon said that his persistence had paid off. That's when Lindley had told him the truth. Brandon claimed that in June of 2017, Lindley had approached a man named Michael Humphrey, and she'd asked him to help her murder her husband. The name Michael Humphrey was one that police were familiar with, and actually it's a name you have heard as well. And that's because Michael Humphrey is the same Michael I told you about earlier in the video, the guy who at one point in time had dated Lindley. Well, as it happened, in addition to being Lindley's ex-boyfriend, Michael was also an ex-convict, and so in Lindley's mind, he was the perfect person to carry out the killing. According to Brandon, Michael had agreed, though in the end, it was Lindley who actually pulled the trigger.
They drove to the farm. He had gloves, he had a firearm. The plan was for him to do it. They get there, he hands her the gun, and says he doesn't feel comfortable doing it. Something she's got to take care of. She walks in with the gun and he just shoots him a bunch of times.
Obviously, this was a huge development, but given the circumstances that had brought Brandon here, detectives had to consider whether he was being truthful. I mean, he was heavily incentivized to try and get Lindley in trouble. So was this a genuine tip or a wild story? When asked about this, Brandon said that he was aware of how this looked, and that detectives didn't have to simply take his word for it. There were other people who could verify what he was saying. Michael, of course, but also a woman named Ashley Shaw. Ashley Shaw worked for Lindley. She was the manager of her spa, and though she initially denied having anything to do with Ben Renick's murder, after being offered immunity in exchange for her cooperation, she admitted that she knew all about the plot. In fact, she had helped Lindley set it up. They'd had Michael come to the spa for an appointment on the day of the murder so that they could explain why he and Lindley had been communicating if they were later asked about this by police. Ashley fully corroborated everything Brandon had said, even the part about Lindley being the shooter. She stated that Michael had picked Lindley up from the spa that afternoon, they'd driven out to the farm, and that when they got there, Ben was taking out some trash. Lindley played it off like Michael was just an old friend who wanted to see some snakes. The plan was for Michael to shoot Ben once they got down into the warehouse, but at the last minute, he backed out. That's when Lindley took the gun Michael brought and carried out the murder herself. Ashley claimed that immediately afterwards, the pair drove back to the spa where she had helped Lindley shower. This is why authorities had never found gunshot residue on her, despite the fact that she was the shooter. Once she was cleaned off, Lindley had texted Ben as if she didn't know where he was, before driving back to the farm with their kids and pretending to stumble across his body. As for why Ashley and Michael had agreed to participate in this horrifying scheme, Ashley said that she believed it was the only way to help Lindley. Shortly before the killing, Lindley had come to her saying that Ben was physically and sexually abusing her, and that she was worried if she tried to leave, he would take the kids. We'll get into Lindley's claims of abuse more a little later, but for now, I'll just say that this appears to be the first police we're hearing of this. Lindley never brought it up before when she was speaking to detectives, nor did anyone else that knew her and Ben. Anyway, moving on to Michael Humphrey. At first, he similarly denied having anything to do with the crime when detectives spoke to him. But after being confronted with the confessions from both Brandon and Ashley, he also said that he was ready to come clean. Well, sort of, anyway. You see, while Michael admitted that he was there when Lindley killed Ben, he claimed that he had no prior knowledge about what was going to happen.
I think I'm just going to lay it all out for you. I think you have some involvement with this.
The first time they came by was just like they wanted me to look at installing some stereo stuff in her friend's car or whatever. I think it was the next time that Lynn came by. She said that she was having some different issues with her significant other. She said that he would abuse her like that. I guess she wanted me to go with her out there to talk to Ben because she said she can't leave.
Mike, she's got other guys in her life. They're all married with kids. They're all family guys with jobs. They're all the same kind of guy.
Wow.
You're the outlier.
I ain't no sugar puller. You know what I mean? I ain't no killer. She tries to hand me a gun, and I kind of just shoved it back at her. We walk up inside, and then all of a sudden shots rang. I ducked like this, and I looked back up. She still got the gun out like this. I turned around and ran towards the door.
According to Michael, he never plotted with Lindley and Ashley. Instead, his story was that Lindley had merely asked him to accompany her that day so that nothing happened to her when she confronted Ben and asked for a divorce. Now, obviously, this is different than Brandon and Ashley's version of events, but most of the essential details were the same. And as far as the inconsistencies, detectives were pretty confident that this was just Michael trying to minimize his role in the crime. With that, Michael Humphrey and Lindley Renick were arrested and charged with Ben's murder. Despite this long overdue breakthrough, though, investigators still had a problem. While they now had 3 separate people who were implicating Lindley in the killing, there was nothing stopping her from coming up with her own story, which is precisely what she did. After being charged, Lindley pointed the finger directly back at Michael, and she did this in a clever way. She said that, yeah, she had asked Michael to come with her so that she could tell Ben she wanted a divorce, but she said that's all she had asked him. Once they actually got to the farm, though, she claimed that Michael went rogue. As she was preparing to talk to Ben, suddenly Michael pulled out a gun and started shooting. Detectives did not buy this at all, but understandably they worried about how well their case could hold up in court if all they really had were competing stories. Well, luckily, by now, they had one other thing that they felt could definitively prove Lindley was lying. And that brings us back to that text conversation I told you about at the very beginning of this video. On May 24th, 2017, so just 15 days before the murder, Ben messaged one of his best friends, a guy named Chase. He said he wanted to tell him about something strange that had happened. He wrote, quote, "I have a funny story. Food poisoning is dumb. Or just poisoning." Chase replied, quote, "LMFAO. I literally think y'all were poisoned at this point." To which Ben replied, "Agreed. Or it was Lindley all along." What Ben was referring to was the previous afternoon when Lindley had asked him to try a drink. She said it was some kind of protein smoothie and that she wanted his opinion on the recipe because she was thinking about selling it at the spa. Ben said that he and Lindley both had some of the smoothie, but that he'd had most of it. And afterwards, he'd gotten incredibly sick. He started throwing up like crazy, and he'd had to spend the rest of the day in bed. Now, he and Chase were joking that maybe Lindley had done something to him on purpose. The text conversation continued, with Chase saying, quote, "LMAO, why would she do it to herself, too? Maybe a customer gave it to you and laughed because they disliked their service." Ben wrote back, quote, "Right? Maybe. Who knows why? She didn't seem as bad as me, so..." To which Chase responded, quote, "LMAO, lighter dose." If you think that's bad, well, the last part of the exchange was by far the most disturbing. It happened when Ben said, quote, "Besides, she needs this Robin deal to pan out first before I die. She would walk away with legit $3 million before selling property for another $1 million. If I died next year, Lindley would be set for life." At the time, Ben and Chase were kidding around. They didn't really think that Lindley had done anything, or at least it doesn't seem like it. However, when authorities came across these messages, they were stunned, especially given what they knew now. The reason these messages became important was because of something else Brandon Blackwell and Ashley Shaw told police during their interviews. They said that the shooting on June 8th may have been what killed Ben Renick, but it wasn't Lindley's only attempt on his life. You see, that smoothie she had given him on May 23rd, it was laced with what was supposed to be a fatal overdose of prescription painkillers. During her confession, Ashley admitted that she was the one who'd helped Lindley obtain the drugs. They crushed them up and put them in the smoothie, intending to poison Ben.
She asked if I could get any prescription pills or anything in the amount that could help her kill him. And so I got her, it was Percocet, I'm pretty sure. And there was, I think, 15 of them.
The original plan had very nearly worked. If Ben hadn't thrown up, the smoothie likely would have killed him. However, once it failed, Ashley said that she and Lindley were forced to pivot. And this is why they brought in Michael Humphrey. With this evidence, investigators finally felt that they had enough to prove their theory of the case. They believed that Michael was in on Ben's murder and that he was fully aware of everything that was going to happen. But ultimately, it was Lindley's plan. She was the one who wanted her husband dead, she was the one who'd come up with both of the plots, and in the end, she was the one who'd pulled the trigger. This is what prosecutors would end up arguing when the case made its way to court. Michael and Lindley were tried separately, and those proceedings began in late 2021. When Michael went on trial in October of that year, things were looking really good. Michael once again tried to claim that he had no idea what Lindley was planning and that he was caught completely by surprise, but his story fell flat, especially when prosecutors pointed out that even Michael admitted it was his gun that was used to murder Ben. Just a side note, remember that detail, because it's going to become important in just a second. Anyway, Michael's version of events failed to convince the jury, and after just a few hours of deliberation, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. While this was definitely promising, prosecutors were still nervous about Lindley's trial, and they had good reason to be. I mean, not only had she proven to be a convincing liar throughout the investigation, she had everyone in her life fooled. Seriously, I'm not exaggerating here. People were shocked when they found out that Lindley had been arrested and charged with Ben's murder. For the longest time, even Sam didn't think that she was responsible, despite the fact that Lindley had repeatedly tried to accuse him of the crime. As a result, to try and shore up their case a little more, prosecutors made a deal with Michael. In exchange for his cooperation, they would knock down his conviction from first-degree to second-degree murder. He'd still have a life sentence, but now he'd be eligible for parole. In exchange, Michael not only agreed to join Ashley Shaw in testifying against Lindley, he told investigators where they could find the murder weapon. This whole time, the gun had been hidden in the attic of his girlfriend's mother's house. Even with all of this, though, when Lindley's trial began in December of 2021, it was an uphill battle. And that's because prosecutors still had to deal with Lindley herself. She ended up taking the stand in her own defense. And when she did, she put on what can perhaps best be described as the performance of a lifetime.
Did you ask Michael to help you kill your husband?
No.
Set the scene for me and the jury.
I walked up right behind Michael, and then Michael turned around, and I saw a gun in his hands, and then I heard shots ring out, and I screamed, and I ran outside. And then I heard more shots go off, and everything just went numb, and I remember staring at the trees, and then Michael running out of the facility and pushing me towards the car and telling me, "We have to go, Lindley, get in the car. We have to go now."
Lindley continued to state that she never intended for Ben to be murdered, and that all she was doing on June 8, 2017, was trying to ask for a divorce. She said that she wanted this because Ben had been abusive.
Lindley, was there ever any other occasion where an argument with Ben turned physical?
Yes. Ben and I had been arguing at the house, and he grabbed my arm and pushed me into the refrigerator and was like, "I'm not done with this. We're going to finish it now."
In addition to this, Lindley claimed that Ben had sexually assaulted her in her sleep. Apparently, her defense team was able to produce messages where it looked like Ben might be apologizing for something. But as far as we can tell, that was the extent of the proof that was offered. Lindley had never called police or reported Ben for any crimes, and it appears she never mentioned Ben's supposed abuse to anyone until she was already plotting his murder. Likewise, as I said before, she only brought up the alleged abuse with investigators after it was already clear she'd been caught. Now, motive is something we haven't really talked a lot about so far in this case, and you might think that's because it's pretty straightforward. Lindley wanted out of her marriage, and she knew that if she killed Ben that she'd end up with this massive inheritance. And while that does seem to be mostly true, the actual details here are worth talking about because they're pretty twisted. For starters, Lindley had cheated on Ben throughout their 3-year marriage. Some of you probably already suspected this, given how quickly she got together with Brandon Blackwell after Ben's murder. But it had happened numerous times. And she was actually pretty candid with police about this during her interviews.
How long did you guys know? It was just sex. Did he think the same way? Yeah.
Just FYI, the guy she's referring to in that clip, it's not even Brandon Blackwell. It's someone totally different. It's unclear to what degree Ben knew about these affairs, but according to some sources we came across during our research, at the time of his death, he was at least suspicious. But that wasn't even the main issue on Ben's mind. The bigger problem had to do with Lindley's business. I told you earlier that Ben helped Lindley open up her spa, which was a significant investment in and of itself. Well, the business was not doing well, to the point that Lindley had stopped paying several of her bills, including contractors who'd done renovations there. Not only were some of these contractors taking Lindley to court, but at the same time, apparently Lindley was secretly using the spa as her own personal piggy bank, taking money out of the business and then spending it on herself. Lindley was doing this completely behind Ben's back, but before his murder, he'd found out about everything. That they had tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Lindley was being sued, and she was stealing from the spa. Authorities learned this thanks to Facebook messages between Lindley and Ben, some of which were sent just hours before Ben was killed. So yeah, prosecutors pointed to all of this, arguing that if anyone wanted out of the relationship, it was Ben. Lindley had put them in a terrible financial position. She was unfaithful, and she realized her lies were catching up with her. And if Ben did decide to divorce her, she knew it would be terrible for her, that she'd likely end up with nothing, and that Ben would get custody of both of their kids. Prosecutors argued this was Lindley's true motive. Yes, she wanted money, but she also needed to prevent all of her secrets from getting out. As for her claims of abuse, prosecutors said they believed this was just another of Lindley's tactics. Another lie in a mountain of lies to try and avoid accountability for what she had done. When it was all over, the jury did convict Lindley, but only of second-degree murder. And sadly, there was still one last gut punch waiting for Ben's loved ones. It seemed that even after everything they had heard, the jury believed at least some of what Lindley had told them, because their sentencing recommendation was just 13 years. Yeah, even the judge in the case was stunned.
Somehow they got confused. In my view, taking you out of the equation, his brother would still be alive. At one minute, you want a divorce and to get Mr. Humphrey mad enough to kill, I don't know, it doesn't matter if he killed. You were the one that put him up to it. You're awful lucky, ma'am. You're going to get out in your 40s, and my 40s weren't too bad. I just hope you don't kill again.
Unfortunately, though, his hands were tied. Legally, he could not exceed the 13 years the jury had recommended. Lindley was given a further 3 years for armed criminal action to be served consecutively, but even so, that only brought the total up to 16. As you might imagine, this felt like an incredible injustice to Ben's loved ones. Even though Lindley had technically been convicted, in some ways, it felt like the true magnitude of what she'd done had been overlooked. I think it was Sam who captured this idea best when he said this during his victim impact statement.
Regarding the verdict, unfortunately, even though the jury is instructed not to have sympathy or to allow their feelings to stand in the way of the facts, we feel that this injustice has in fact taken place in this case. We thank the state prosecution team for their hard work in this trial, and we hope that the facts would speak for themselves. I beg the common person to watch the trial again and ask themselves if my brother's life was worth only 16 years.
At the time of this recording, Lindley Renick remains incarcerated at the Women's Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Vandalia, Missouri. Even if she serves her entire 16-year sentence, though, she will be released before her 50th birthday. There's a lot I could say about how it feels like justice wasn't really served in this case, and I have a feeling many of you feel the same way. But I've already gone on for quite a while here, so I'm going to try and keep this short. One of the few silver linings I can point to here is that when all of this was over, it seems Lindley was prevented from profiting from Ben's death. Obviously, authorities were too late to stop her from selling the Renick farm, but she never received the payout from Ben's life insurance policy, and she was barred from collecting any additional money or property from his estate. According to news articles from the time, Ben's remaining assets were placed into a trust for his children. Some sources seem to suggest most, if not all of that, might have gone to Emma, since technically she was Ben's only biological child, though it's clear from numerous interviews we saw that Ben very much considered Matthew to be his son as well. Speaking of which, one of the most gut-wrenching details we came across while researching for this story concerned Matthew's reaction to Ben's death. According to one family friend, one of the things they remembered most about Ben's funeral was Matthew being inconsolable and asking his mother over and over again why this had happened. Obviously, this is even more heartbreaking in hindsight, knowing that Lindley was the one who was responsible for all of this. And I think that really underscores the tragic irony of this whole story. Ben Renick spent his whole life working around potentially deadly snakes. But in the end, the most dangerous one was the one he never realized he'd invited into his home. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.